and it's a pleasure to have Caroline Glick with us. And she's a great columnist and articles she's written here in the U.S. and in Israel. And nobody better to ask Caroline Glick, what in the world is going on in the great state of Israel?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on your show again, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
What's happening in Israel is that Israel's unelected elites are having a temper tantrum because for the first time, the majority of Israelis who are not members of the elites and who are center-right are saying that they want to have the power to govern when they actually win elections. Because until now, things have just been going along, and the deep state, as you refer to it here in the United States, is our permanent bureaucracy is very much in the hands of the left. And initially, it wasn't such a terrible thing because they were patriotic. But just as we see throughout the Western world over the past generation, the left in Israel has become increasingly radicalized, and so it required judicial reform. And because the main focal point of their power is the judiciary and the legal system more generally. We have a rule of lawyers in Israel, not a rule of law. And so this government, the Netanyahu government, ran on a platform of legal reform. And the first item of business when they were elected was to fulfill their pledge to the voters and enact judicial reform and overall legal reform of our system, because our judiciary has limitless powers and they have to have checks and balances placed on them. And so as soon as the government set about fulfilling its commitment to the voters, the left in Israel, both the political left and the entrenched elites, the media, started running a campaign very much like the campaigns that you guys had here in 2020, with riots in the streets, people mimicking Antifa, trying to block members of our parliament, the Knesset, from leaving their homes in the morning yesterday to vote on a key vote for the judicial reform legislation that's making its way through the Knesset, and calling for civil war, threatening civil war, calling for economic warfare against Israel, saying that they're going to move their companies out of the country, threatening our markets. So all of this stuff is going on in Israel, and basically it's our economic elites, it's our media elites, and of course our legal elites are saying that if they can't run the show, then the show is illegitimate. And so that's what we're facing right now in Israel.
You know, we've been talking about this on our show, and so the public in this audience has some general knowledge of this. And basically, you have this guy, Barak, he becomes Chief Justice, and he changes your country. He eliminates any notion of separation of powers. He changes the language, reasonableness, and public interest, and all the rest. You don't have a constitution. He decides which basic laws are going to rule your country. There's no standing, so any issue can be brought before the court. So they get involved in strategic military decisions, who can serve in the cabinet. I mean, there's nothing that they won't do and say, and then they claim, as most totalitarians do, that they're doing it on behalf of the people and for the people, when in fact they're doing it in defiance of the people. And typically, you've got the left, and in your case, the left in Israel is really the left, the media is really the left. They wrap themselves in democracy when, in fact, it's Netanyahu and his government that's trying to bring some balance, some semblance of democracy back to the country, correct?
It's true. I mean, what we're seeing today, what we've been seeing over the past two months since the government came into office, is that they're redefining words, so that democracy now means tyranny. Minority rights now means minority tyranny now is proclaimed minority rights. Democracy means that the minority gets to dictate to the majority what it's supposed to do in order for them to be enlightened and proper. And so, yes, we're seeing a complete, and the media in Israel is really a full partner in this propaganda campaign to demonize the government when it's trying to restore democracy. And so, yeah, by the way, what you were saying about Aaron Barak is absolutely right. I mean, he enacted this constitutional transformation of Israel from a parliamentary democracy into justiciocracy, if you will, or a lawyerocracy. When most people's heads were turned, but even his left-wing colleagues at the Hebrew University Law School opposed what he did at the time because they said this is the constitutional transformation of the country and you can't do this. Everybody, that's just gone down the memory hole. Nobody even remembers that among people who understood what was happening, this was deeply controversial. Now everybody's lockstep saying that this is the only way to keep democracy, as if for the first 40 years of Israel's history, we weren't a democracy when we were. And so what we're seeing now is an effort by Israel's political leaders to take back only some of the powers that the Supreme Court and the public attorneys, the state prosecutor, the attorney general, arrogated to themselves. They seized without basis in law from the Knesset and from the government, and they seized it for themselves. And so what we're seeing now is the government and the Knesset trying to take back some of the powers that were seized from them. And the response has been outrageous. And we see it then parroted in the U.S. media and among senior members of the Biden administration, and saying that there's an assault on Israeli democracy, and that if the judicial reform goes through to ensure that the people's will be done by our elected leaders, that Israel is going to cease being a democracy, and then American support for Israel will be in question because it will no longer be a democracy. And it's really very upsetting and alarming when we see this kind of tantrum at home, rioting in the streets, threatening political leaders with death, threatening the country with civil war, and it's being backed by international leaders, by President Biden, ostensibly through his ambassador, who ordered the government to pump on the brakes and stop. Secretary of State Blinken has spoken about this, President Biden, the President of France, and today the UN Human Rights Council all said that they oppose judicial reform in Israel. Why do they care? I mean, this is an internal Israeli matter. Why are they opposed to the restoration of democracy in Israel, and why are they siding with one side of a political dispute, a domestic political dispute about the way that democracy in Israel is supposed to operate?
And these are rhetorical questions, I assume, because the old European socialists that founded this government in Israel, well, conservatives started winning, as we call them in the United States. You had Begin, you've got Netanyahu, the longest-serving collectively prime minister. Mm-hmm. And so they figured they could run this government permanently, and they have to do it through the judiciary, which is something Woodrow Wilson said in this country, too, because they know that these people are of a certain mindset uniformly all over the world, and that they have these belief systems. And you also have these groups in the United States signing letters and sending them over. So there's a massive pressure campaign going on against the people of Israel. But I want to get back to Biden. There's even more that's going on here. You know, Biden likes to talk about democracy and freedom and so forth. But just recently, they went back to this two-state solution. You wrote an entire book on why that's a bad idea, but two-state solution. They go back 1967 boundaries, Thomas Friedman writes, and then you talk about land from there and so forth. And they never talk about what Abbas is doing or what Hamas is doing, the terrorism against the Israel. They never talk about the history of Judea and Samaria. Jews are the only indigenous peoples that are not viewed as indigenous peoples in their own homeland, correct?
It's absolutely true, and it's really alarming because, I mean, the Palestinian national identity, such as it is completely appropriated from the Jewish national identity and Jewish history. They seize our history. If you go to Israel today and you travel through Judea and Samaria, you see some of the most important historical sites for Judeo-Christian civilization. I mean, we're talking about Joshua's altar. which the children of Israel built after they crossed the Jordan River. We're talking about the places that the Maccabees are buried, where their palaces were. We're talking about significant, very important world historic sites, much more important from a Western civilizational perspective than, say, the Banyam statues in Afghanistan that the Taliban blew up. But here you see that UNESCO and all of the organizations that are supposed to care about cultural heritage are on the side of the Palestinians, who are systematically annihilating these historical sites. And the EU, actually, they had an internal document that was exposed a month ago that showed that it is the policy of the European Union to help the Palestinians destroy the remnants of Jewish civilization in Judea and Samaria. And they're plowing over some of the most important artifacts. Why? Because they want to appropriate the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel to themselves. They call themselves Canaanites. They call themselves all sorts of things, Philistines. And they say that they are those are their ancestors. It's untrue. There's absolutely no historical basis for these claims. But then they want to erase the historical record of continuous Jewish settlement in the land of Israel for the past 3,500 years. And so this is something, of course, that the United States should be banging on tables about, right? But instead, they're facilitating it, and efforts on Israel's part to maintain the historical record, whether on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem or throughout Judea and Samaria, the Americans opposed. And they say that Israel is undermining prospects for peace. So, I mean, this is the kind of upside-down world that you live in when you want to tell yourselves and you base your policy on the myth that Israel is responsible for the absence of peace with the Palestinians, when in fact the Palestinians exist in order to deny that the Jews have a right to national self-determination.
What did what happened with the UN and the Biden administration?
So the Palestinians, through the UAE, put forward a new anti-Israel resolution in the UN Security Council to condemn Israel for giving upgraded status to 9 Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. And this is sort of a classic Obama move. What they did was they said, well, we don't want to have to veto this, so we're going to block it from coming up. And then they blocked it after hanging the threat over Israel for a few days. Well, we don't want to have to veto this. We totally oppose what you're doing in Judea and Samaria, allowing Jews to be connected to electricity and water in their homes. And so we don't want to veto this, even though we should, because there's no reason why anybody would be coming after you. So then they convinced the Palestinians to withhold their resolution, and the Security Council came out with a declaration condemning Israel instead of a resolution. The Biden administration gets congratulated for not having this resolution come forward, and Israel gets condemned anyway. And so this is something sort of classic way of being passive-aggressive. On the one hand, you say, well, we want to protect you, but you're acting badly. Now, why is Israel acting badly? Nobody ever examines that concept. What is wrong with Jews living in Judea and Samaria? Why is that terrible? It's not illegal. Mike Pompeo made changed the position of the State Department on Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria in 2019 because the previous position that said that they were illegal wasn't aligned with international law. And so he changed that position, said there's nothing inherently illegal about any of this. And yet the Biden administration, just as they want to revert back to opposing Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem, so they want to revert back to this position that Israel's responsible for the absence of peace, and the greatest obstacle to peace is Jews living in communities in their ancestral homeland, in Judea and Samaria.
Haven't Palestinians moved into areas there that they're not supposed to be in, even under agreements, and have illegally taken over land in those areas?
Well, it's not just that. They're doing it in a strategic way to endanger the Jewish communities. Because, again, you have to understand that Palestinian identity is organized around negating Israel's right to exist and rejecting Israel's right to exist, and by, among other things, killing Israelis in terrorist attacks. So where, use of land is also a strategic weapon to try to make Jews more vulnerable to attack. So what they're doing is they're seizing illegally, and it's all funded by the EU. They're seizing lands really adjacent to the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and endangering them in this way. And then when Israel comes in and destroys illegal structures, it's condemned.
Caroline Glick, if people want to read you or reach you, where do they go?
Well, I'm the senior contributing editor at jns.org, which is a Jewish news service, and they can read me there or at my website, carolineglick.com, and at Newsweek.